October 1951. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base sat under a gray morning sky, cold and quiet. A covered transport truck rolled through the gates, carrying something that would shatter everything American engineers thought they knew about Soviet technology. Frank Mueller pressed his face to his office window, watching the truck disappear into Hangar 7. Inside that truck was an intact MiG-15, flown to freedom by a defecting North Korean pilot. Frank had been chosen to lead the examination team. He expected crude Soviet engineering, heavy metal, clunky design, everything the propaganda posters had promised about communist incompetence. But when they fired up that MiG's engine and ran the first performance tests, Frank's coffee mug slipped from his trembling hands. The numbers on his clipboard made no sense. This primitive Soviet fighter was faster, more agile, and more fuel-efficient than America's best jets. Frank stared at the data, feeling his entire worldview crack like thin ice. His son was training to be a pilot. This plane could be hunting American boys in the Korean skies right now. Everything they'd been told about Soviet capabilities was a lie. But before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories that challenge what you think you know about history, smash that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. These stories reach everywhere. The coffee had gone cold again. Frank Mueller set down his cup and rubbed his eyes, the October morning light filtering through his office window at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, painting everything the color of old steel. He'd been at his desk since 5:30, reviewing personnel files for what would either be the most routine assignment of his career or something that would keep him awake for months to come. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Colonel Morrison stepped inside, his uniform pressed to geometric perfection. "Frank, I need you to take point on something sensitive. We've got a gift from our friends across the Pacific." Frank looked up from the files scattered across his desk. "What kind of gift?" "A MiG-15, intact. North Korean pilot defected 3 days ago, flew it straight to Kimpo Air Base. State Department's already processed him, and now the bird's ours to examine." Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. "I want your best people on this. Everything by the book, everything documented, everything classified." Frank felt something shift in his chest. A captured Soviet fighter. In 18 months as a German POW, he'd learned that understanding your enemy's capabilities could mean the difference between life and death. But this felt different somehow. Bigger. "When does it arrive?" "It's already here. Hangar 7. I'm assigning Dr. Richter to your team for the technical analysis and Miss Kim for translation work." Morrison paused at the door. "Frank, I want you to know what we're expecting to find. Soviet engineering is crude, inefficient, cobbled together from stolen technology. This examination should confirm what we already know about communist industrial capacity." After Morrison left, Frank stared at the closed door for a long moment. What we already know. He'd heard those words before, in briefing rooms and strategy sessions, always delivered with the same confident certainty. What they knew about German engineering had cost him his crew over the skies of Schweinfurt. What they knew about enemy tactics had left him in a POW camp for 18 months, learning that survival meant questioning every assumption. He walked to the window and watched a covered transport truck disappear behind Hangar 7. Somewhere inside that truck was a machine built by men who spoke a different language, served a different ideology, but solved the same fundamental problems of lift and thrust and control that kept aircraft in the sky. Frank had spent 15 years designing fighter planes, and he'd learned that physics didn't care about politics. Dr. Hans Richter was already waiting in the hangar when Frank arrived, standing beside a tarp-covered shape that dominated the center of the space. The German engineer looked smaller than Frank remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched as he studied a clipboard with the focused intensity Frank had come to recognize. Hans worked with the precision of a man who understood that small mistakes in aircraft design killed people. "Morning, Hans." Frank extended his hand. "Ready to see what the other side's been building?" Hans looked up, his pale blue eyes reflecting something Frank couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps, or anticipation. "I confess I am curious. In my work before the war, we often wondered what innovations might emerge from different approaches to the same engineering challenges." Miss Kim arrived moments later, carrying a leather satchel and moving with the efficient grace Frank had noticed during her previous translation assignments. Grace Kim was 28, Korean-American, and possessed a combination of engineering training and linguistic skill that made her invaluable for technical document analysis. Frank had initially questioned Morrison's decision to include her on the team, but her work on captured German documents had been flawless. "Good morning, Mr. Mueller, Dr. Richter." She set down her satchel and looked at the covered aircraft. "I understand there may be documentation to review?" "Likely." Frank pulled away the corner of the tarp, revealing the nose cone of the MiG-15. "Shall we see what we're dealing with?" They removed the covering together, and Frank felt his breath catch. The aircraft was smaller than he'd expected, sleeker with clean lines that spoke of careful aerodynamic consideration. The silver skin gleamed under the hangar lights, unmarked except for faded North Korean insignia. It looked fast, even sitting still. Hans circled the aircraft, slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally stopping to examine a particular detail. "The intake design is quite sophisticated. See here how they've managed the airflow transition." Grace had found a canvas bag containing the aircraft's technical documentation and was spreading papers across a nearby table. "The documentation appears complete. Flight manual, maintenance logs, technical specifications. Everything's in Russian, with some Korean annotations." Frank walked around to the cockpit and peered inside. The instrument panel was laid out differently than American fighters, but the basic elements were familiar. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, engine gauges. Tools of the trade, regardless of the language printed on their faces. "Let's start with a basic visual inspection, then we'll see about getting her fired up." As they began their work, Frank found himself studying his colleagues as much as the aircraft. Hans approached each component with scientific curiosity, making careful notes and occasional sketches. Grace moved between the documentation and the aircraft itself, cross-referencing technical terms and asking clarifying questions about specific systems. They worked well together, Frank realized. 3 people from different backgrounds, brought together by circumstances none of them could have predicted. But it was the aircraft itself that captured Frank's attention. The more he examined it, the more he found himself questioning his assumptions about Soviet manufacturing capabilities. The metalwork was precise, the systems integration thoughtful, the overall design philosophy surprisingly elegant. This wasn't the crude, heavy engineering he'd been expecting. It was something else entirely. The engine test came on their 3rd day. Frank stood behind the blast barrier, his hands gripping the clipboard so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The MiG's Klimov engine spooled up with a distinctive whine that was somehow different from the American jets he'd heard thousands of times before. Cleaner, maybe. More refined. Hans monitored the instruments from the control booth, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Throttle at 60%, temperature nominal. Fuel flow is remarkably efficient." A pause. "Frank, you should see these numbers." Grace looked up from her translation work, pencil suspended over a page of Russian technical notes. "The maintenance logs indicate this engine has over 400 flight hours. According to these specifications, it should be showing significant wear by now." Frank watched the exhaust shimmer in the cold hangar air. 400 hours on a Soviet engine, and it was running like it had just rolled off the assembly line. American engines needed major overhauls at 300 hours. "Hans, bring her up to 80%. The whine intensified, but the engine note remained smooth, steady. No vibration, no irregular fluctuations in the exhaust temperature. Frank felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the October weather. "These thrust-to-weight ratios," Hans said when they shut down the engine an hour later. He was staring at his calculations, double-checking figures that Frank could see were correct the first time. "If these numbers are accurate, this aircraft outperforms our F-86 in every category except maximum speed. And even that margin is smaller than expected." Grace had spread the maintenance documentation across 3 tables, creating what looked like a paper archaeological dig. "There's something else. These aren't just technical manuals." She held up a page covered in Cyrillic script. "Look at the margins. Personal notes, sketches, calculations that have nothing to do with standard procedures." Frank leaned over her shoulder to examine the page. Even without reading Russian, he could see what she meant. The official text was printed in neat columns, but the margins were filled with handwritten annotations, small diagrams, what looked like mathematical proofs worked out in the blank spaces between paragraphs. "What kind of notes?" Frank asked. Grace traced one section with her finger. "This engineer, V. Petrov, he's calculating stress loads for emergency maneuvers. But not just standard combat situations. He's working out scenarios for when a pilot might need to push the aircraft beyond normal limits to get home safely." She flipped to another page. "Here, someone named Kozlov has redesigned the fuel pump to improve reliability during negative G flight. These aren't factory specifications, Frank. These are personal improvements." Hans had been standing quietly beside the aircraft's wing, but now he approached their improvised translation station. "May I see those calculations?" Grace handed him the page, and Frank watched Hans's expression change as he studied the handwritten formulas. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been admiration. "This is sophisticated work," Hans said quietly. "The mathematical approach to wing loading optimization, the consideration of pilot safety factors." He paused, looking at Frank. "I know this methodology. We used similar principles in our work at Messerschmitt." The words hung in the air between them. Frank felt pieces clicking into place, connections forming that he should have made days ago. "Hans, when you say we, I was part of the design team for the Me-262. Hans set down the page carefully as if it might break. "Before that, the Me-109 Improvements Program. I helped develop many of the aerodynamic principles I'm seeing in the Soviet aircraft." Frank stared at the man he'd been working alongside for 2 years. Dr. Hans Richter, whose background file he'd never read completely, whose quiet competence and meticulous attention to detail had made him invaluable to the American aircraft development program. Hans, who spoke with a slight accent Frank had always assumed was Austrian or Swiss. "The Soviets captured you?" Frank asked. "No." Hans's voice was barely above a whisper. "They captured my work. Technical documents, test data, prototype components. When Berlin fell, they took everything they could find." He gestured toward the MiG. "But they didn't just copy it. They improved it, made it better than what we had achieved." Grace looked between them, understanding passing across her face. "The engineering approaches in these notes, the safety considerations, the pilot-focused design philosophy. It's not just Soviet innovation. It's German engineering refined by Russian practicality." Frank walked back to the aircraft, running his hand along the wing's leading edge. The metal was smooth, precisely machined, shaped with an understanding of airflow that came from years of research and testing. But there was something else, something in the way the components fit together that spoke of care beyond mere functionality. "There's a note here," Grace said, her voice soft. "Hidden in the engine maintenance section. It's not official documentation." She translated slowly, carefully. "Papa builds things that fly so you never have to. Love, V. Petrov." Frank stopped walking. In his mind, he saw his son David, 22 years old and learning to fly at Randolph Air Force Base, writing home about aerial combat techniques and fighter tactics. David, who trusted that his father's work would keep him safe when the time came to put those techniques into practice over the skies of Korea. Hans was sketching again, his pencil moving across a notepad with unconscious precision. But this time, Frank recognized the wing design taking shape on the paper. It was the MiG's wing, but modified, improved, made safer. "Their fathers, too," Grace said quietly, still looking at the Russian engineer's note to his son. "The men who built this plane, they have children, they want to come home." Frank nodded, understanding settling over him like a weight he'd been carrying without knowing it. The Soviet Union wasn't some faceless enemy producing crude weapons in grim factories. It was engineers and fathers and men who stayed late at their drawing boards, making calculations in the margins of technical manuals, trying to build machines that would bring their sons home alive, just like him. The breakthrough came during their examination of the ejection seat system. Frank had been expecting a crude catapult mechanism, something that would get a pilot out of the aircraft, but with little regard for his survival afterward. What they found instead was a marvel of engineering restraint. "Look at this harness design," Hans said, his fingers tracing the webbing pattern. "The load distribution points, the way the straps are angled to minimize spinal compression during ejection. This is more sophisticated than anything we have." Grace was translating the seat's technical manual, but she kept pausing, rereading sections with growing amazement. According to these specifications, the ejection sequence includes a 3-second delay system. After the pilot pulls the handle, the seat waits to ensure optimal trajectory before firing. She looked up at Frank. They built in time for the pilot to change his mind. Frank knelt beside the seat, studying the mechanism. In his 18 months as a POW, he'd heard stories of German pilots who'd ejected from damaged aircraft only to be killed by their own ejection systems. The Americans were working on improvements, but their focus had been on getting pilots out quickly, not necessarily safely. "What's the survival rate listed in the manual?" 93%, Grace said quietly. "Under combat conditions." Hans had moved to examine the aircraft's oxygen system, but Frank could see him listening. "In our work on the Me-262," Hans said without looking up, "pilot survival was considered secondary to mission effectiveness. The aircraft was designed to be expendable. The pilot was expected to be expendable too." "Not here," Frank said, running his hand along the ejection seat's headrest. The padding was thick, designed to protect the pilot's neck during the violent acceleration of ejection. Someone had spent considerable time calculating the exact density needed, the precise angle of support. "Every system I've examined has redundancy built in. Backup fuel pumps, duplicate hydraulic lines, emergency power systems. This aircraft was designed to bring its pilot home." Grace had found another set of handwritten notes tucked between pages of the flight manual. "There's a modification log here, signed by the same V. Petrov. He's documented 17 separate improvements to pilot safety systems. Changes made after the aircraft left the factory." She translated slowly. "Testing notes indicate these modifications were implemented across multiple aircraft in the squadron." Frank felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't just one engineer making personal improvements. This was systematic, deliberate enhancement of pilot safety across an entire unit. They were sharing the innovations? "More than that," Grace said. According to these notes, Petrov was collaborating with engineers from other design bureaus. Look, here's a reference to improvements suggested by someone at the Yakovlev design office and another from Mikoyan Gurevich. She paused in her translation. They were working together across competing organizations to make their aircraft safer. Hans straightened up from his examination of the oxygen system. The redundancy in this life support system is remarkable. If the primary oxygen supply fails, there are 3 separate backup systems, and each backup has its own backup. He shook his head slowly. We talked about this level of safety integration at Messerschmitt, but we never implemented it. Too expensive, too complex, too much weight. What changed your mind? Frank asked. I mean, what made you decide pilot safety was worth the extra complexity? Hans was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the oxygen regulator. Near the end of the war, I received a letter from the mother of a pilot. Her son had been flying an aircraft I helped design. The oxygen system failed, and he couldn't bail out safely. Hans's voice became even softer. She didn't blame me. She thanked me for trying to build something that would keep him safe. That was worse than blame. Grace had put down her pencil and was listening intently. Frank realized this was the most Hans had ever shared about his past, about the weight he carried from his work during the war. After that, Hans continued, I began to see every technical specification differently, not as an engineering challenge, but as someone's son, someone's father, someone's husband, depending on my decisions. He gestured toward the MiG's cockpit. These Soviet engineers, they understand that responsibility. Frank climbed into the cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat. The ergonomics were different from American fighters, but thoughtfully arranged. Every control was within easy reach, every gauge positioned for quick reading under stress. The seat itself was contoured to provide support during high G maneuvers while allowing freedom of movement for emergency procedures. There's something else, Grace said. She'd been working through a thick manual filled with technical diagrams. This maintenance schedule, it's not just about keeping the aircraft operational. Look at these inspection intervals. She showed them a chart covered in Russian text and technical symbols. Every 50 flight hours, they inspect the ejection seat mechanisms. Every 100 hours, they test the emergency systems. They're not just maintaining the aircraft, they're maintaining the pilot's chances of survival. Frank thought about the maintenance schedules for American fighters. They focused on engine performance, weapons systems, operational readiness. Pilot safety systems were checked when they failed, not as preventive maintenance. How often do we test our ejection seats? When a pilot reports a problem, Hans said, or after an incident. They test theirs every 2 weeks, Grace said, whether there's a problem or not. Frank sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by instruments labeled in a language he couldn't read, but increasingly understanding the philosophy behind their placement. These Soviet engineers had approached fighter design from a fundamentally different perspective. They weren't just building weapons, they were building machines to preserve the lives of the men who flew them. I need to write a report, Frank said finally. Colonel Morrison is expecting an assessment of Soviet capabilities. Hans and Grace looked at him, waiting. I'm going to recommend immediate implementation of ejection seat improvements based on this design, and I'm going to suggest we completely revise our pilot safety protocols. Frank climbed out of the cockpit. This aircraft is going to save American lives. Grace smiled, the first genuine smile Frank had seen from her since they'd started working together. V. Petrov would be proud. Frank spent 3 days writing the report, working late into the evenings, while Grace and Hans compiled supporting documentation. The technical specifications were undeniable, the safety innovations revolutionary, the implications for American aircraft development profound. He wrote with the precision of an engineer and the passion of a father, knowing that David and thousands of other young pilots might depend on these recommendations. Colonel Morrison read the report in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he set it down on his desk and looked at Frank with something approaching disappointment. "This isn't what we discussed." "It's what we found," Frank said. "The MiG-15 represents a significant advancement in fighter aircraft design. Our pilots are facing technology superior to our own in several critical areas." Morrison stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back. "Frank, I'm going to explain something about the bigger picture here. We're fighting a war of morale as much as bullets. The American people need to believe in our technological superiority. Congress needs to believe it when they appropriate funding for our programs." He turned back to Frank. "What you're suggesting would undermine confidence in our entire defense industry." "What I'm suggesting would save pilots' lives," Frank replied. "Sir? That's not your decision to make." Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your job is to assess enemy capabilities and recommend appropriate responses, not to advocate for wholesale adoption of Soviet technology." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he'd learned to recognize as a warning. The same feeling he'd had when his commanding officer had insisted the bombing run over Schweinfurt would be a milk run, despite intelligence suggesting heavy fighter presence. "With respect, Colonel, if we ignore what we've learned here, we're sending our pilots into combat with inferior equipment." Morrison returned to his desk and picked up a different folder. "Dr. Richter is being reassigned, effective immediately. His security clearance is under review pending investigation of his wartime activities." He opened the folder. "It seems there are questions about his involvement in German rocket programs that may have utilized forced labor." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Hans had never spoken about rockets, had focused entirely on conventional aircraft design. But Frank realized that Morrison didn't care about the accuracy of the allegations. He cared about removing a voice that might support Frank's conclusions. "Hans has been cleared by our security office multiple times. Circumstances change. New information comes to light." Morrison's tone was matter-of-fact, administrative. "Miss Kim is also being reassigned. There are concerns about her family connections and potential communist sympathies." Frank stared at Morrison, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. This wasn't about security clearances or administrative efficiency. This was about silencing anyone who might corroborate what they'd found in Hangar 7. Grace's brother is missing in action in Korea. Her family was interned during the war. She's been investigated more thoroughly than anyone in this facility. "I'm sure you understand the delicate nature of our current international situation," Morrison continued, as if Frank hadn't spoken. "The State Department has expressed concern about any intelligence assessment that might be interpreted as favorable to Soviet capabilities." Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him, the same sensation he'd experienced when his B-17 had taken the flak hit that would lead to his capture. Systems failing, altitude dropping, options disappearing one by one. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Morrison slid a thin folder across the desk. "A revised report, one that confirms our expectations about Soviet industrial capacity and recommends continued focus on our existing development programs." He paused. "Take your time with it, but have it on my desk by Monday." Frank picked up the folder without opening it. Inside, he knew, would be a template for the report Morrison wanted. Conclusions pre-written, technical assessments predetermined, recommendations that would justify existing budgets and procurement decisions. A document that would have nothing to do with what they'd actually discovered. "And the MiG?" "Will be transferred to a different facility for additional study. Your team's work here is complete." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Frank, you've served this country with distinction. Don't let misguided idealism damage a career that could continue to benefit our national defense for years to come. Frank stood, the folder heavy in his hands. Through Morrison's window, he could see Hangar 7 in the distance, where Hans and Grace were probably still working, unaware that their access would be terminated within hours. Where a Soviet aircraft that had taught them more about engineering humanity than any American design had been teaching young pilots how to think beyond the boundaries of nationality and ideology. "I'll need to discuss this with my team," Frank said. "Your team has been disbanded. Dr. Richter and Miss Kim have already been notified." Morrison returned to his paperwork. "Their materials have been collected and classified. You'll be working independently from now on." Frank walked back to his office in a daze, the folder tucked under his arm, like evidence of some crime he'd unwittingly committed. The coffee on his desk was cold again, but he poured himself a cup anyway, standing at his window and staring at the hangar that had become the center of their world for the past 2 weeks. His phone rang, David calling from flight training as he did every Friday evening. "Dad, you sound tired. Everything all right?" Frank closed his eyes, hearing his son's voice bright with anticipation, full of trust that the aircraft he'd soon be flying had been designed by people who cared more about bringing him home than about proving political points. "Everything's fine, son. How's the training going?" "Great. We start advanced maneuvers next week. The instructors say our F-86s are the best fighters in the world. Nothing can touch them." Frank opened the folder Morrison had given him and stared at the first page. A summary that described Soviet aircraft as technically inferior and operationally limited. Conclusions that would ensure American pilots continued flying with ejection seats that killed them 30% of the time, with safety systems that had been obsolete before the war in Korea began. "Dad, you still there?" "I'm here," Frank said. "David, I want you to be extra careful up there. Pay attention to your emergency procedures. Make sure you know your aircraft better than the men who built it." "Always do. Love you, Dad." "Love you too, son." Frank hung up the phone and stared at the report template until the words blurred together. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out his own copy of their real findings, the document that Morrison wanted to disappear forever. Frank sat alone in his office that Sunday evening, the building empty around him except for the night security guard making his rounds. The falsified report lay before him, completed according to Morrison's specifications. 14 pages that described Soviet technology as primitive, inefficient, no threat to American air superiority. Everything the Pentagon wanted to hear, everything that would keep funding flowing to existing programs, everything that would send pilots like David into combat with inferior safety systems. His real report sat in his desk drawer, locked away like contraband. The truth about ejection seat design, about pilot survival systems, about engineering philosophy that put human life before political ideology. Frank had made photocopies, hidden them in different places around his office, unable to bring himself to destroy what might be the only honest assessment of what they'd discovered. The phone rang, startling him in the silence. Hans's voice was quiet, strained. "Frank, I wanted to say goodbye before I left. They're transferring me to civilian contractor status, effective tomorrow." "Where will you go?" "Boeing has offered me a position in their commercial aircraft division, passenger planes." There was a long pause. "Perhaps that's where I belong, building things that only carry people safely from one place to another." Frank closed his eyes. Hans's expertise in fighter design was unmatched. His understanding of the subtle relationship between aerodynamics and pilot survival, something that had taken years to develop. Losing him would set back American aircraft development by months, maybe years. "I'm sorry, Hans. This isn't right." "I've been thinking about what we learned in that hangar," Hans said. "About the Soviet engineers, their approach to design. I realized something. The nationality of the man who builds the aircraft matters much less than what's in his heart when he builds it. Another pause. Those Russian engineers were building with love, Frank. Love for the pilots who would fly their machines. That's what made their work superior, not their technical training or their industrial capacity. After Hans hung up, Frank sat in the darkness, thinking about love as an engineering principle. In his POW camp, he'd met a German engineer who'd risked his life to smuggle extra food to Allied prisoners. Not because he agreed with their cause, but because he couldn't stand to watch men suffer when he had the power to help. Love expressed through action, through choices made when no one was watching. The next morning, Frank made his choice. He walked to Morrison's office and submitted the falsified report, watching the colonel's satisfied expression as he scanned the conclusions. Then Frank returned to his office and began making phone calls. The first call went to Major Williams in the Air Force Safety Office, a man Frank had known since flight training. "Bill, I'm sending you some technical specifications I think you should see, unofficially. They might give you ideas for improving our ejection seat systems." The second call went to Captain Rodriguez in the Flight Test Division. "Luis, there are some modifications to pilot oxygen systems that could save lives. I'm putting together an informal technical brief. Interested?" One by one, Frank called engineers throughout Wright-Patterson, men he'd worked with over the years, men he trusted to care more about pilot safety than bureaucratic politics. He shared pieces of their findings, technical innovations disguised as theoretical improvements, safety enhancements presented as American innovations rather than Soviet discoveries. Grace found him in the cafeteria that afternoon, carrying a box of personal items from her office. She set it down and joined him at his table, looking older than her 28 years, the light in her eyes dimmed but not extinguished. "I heard about your reassignment," Frank said. "I'm sorry." "They're sending me to the translation division at the Pentagon. Standard document work, nothing classified." She managed a small smile. "At least I'll still be serving." Frank leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Grace, before you go, I need to ask you something. Those personal notes you found in the Soviet documentation, the letters between engineers. Did you translate all of them?" "Most of them." She looked around the cafeteria, making sure they weren't overheard. "Why?" "I want to write to them, to the families of the engineers who designed that aircraft, through the Red Cross maybe, or academic channels." Frank's words came in a rush. "I want them to know their work saved American lives, that engineers in Ohio learned from their father's innovations, their husband's safety improvements." Grace stared at him for a long moment. "Frank, that could be interpreted as what? As recognizing that good engineering transcends national boundaries? As acknowledging that a father's love for his son is the same whether he lives in Moscow or Ohio?" Frank's voice grew stronger. "As treating our enemies like human beings instead of faceless threats?" Grace reached into her box and pulled out a manila folder. "I kept copies of the personal correspondence, against regulations." She slid the folder across the table. V. Petrov's address, his family information, the names and locations of the other engineers who contributed to the safety modifications. Frank took the folder, feeling its weight like a responsibility. "What will you do with it?" "What you said. I'll find a way to let them know their work mattered." She stood, picking up her box. "And Frank, I'm going to keep translating, not just Russian technical documents, but human stories, the things that connect us across languages and borders." That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table and began writing the first letter. He wrote about Hans, a German engineer who'd learned that nationality mattered less than the intention behind the work. He wrote about Grace, a Korean-American translator who'd shown them that understanding your enemy's humanity was the first step toward ending conflict. He wrote about himself, an American engineer who discovered that the best way to serve his country was to learn from its enemies. Most of all, he wrote about the MiG-15, an aircraft built with such care for pilot survival that it had changed how 3 Americans thought about engineering, about war, about the possibility that enemies might also be fathers trying to bring their sons home safely. Frank sealed the letter addressed to V. Petrov in care of the Red Cross International Committee and placed it in his briefcase. Tomorrow he would begin the process of building bridges across the divide of the Cold War, one letter at a time, one human connection at a moment when such connections seemed impossible. The truth about the MiG-15 might be classified, buried in files that would remain sealed for decades. But the truth about the men who'd built it and the men who'd studied it would find its way across borders and through barriers, carried by people who understood that good engineering was really about love.